This particular seminar, just for those of you who are joining us for the first time, is really about how the sausage is made. You may have taken other seminars that will tell you about research methods. You may have read some stories. You may be engaged in some of these processes yourself. But you sometimes see the reports and you read the articles, but there's not very often opportunities for us to really talk with researchers about how they went about doing the work. Last week, we had a seminar on ethnography, and something that really struck me about that seminar, which was brilliant with colleagues, was the fact that there's an illustration that ethnography was a bit of a process of, unlike traditional research, where the position of the researcher is often on the edge of the action, looking down. This is an image many of you know from a famous artist here from the north of England, David Hockney, but really looking down and observing the action, and researchers often position themselves like that. There's a fantastic illustration that Clive Palmer had from one of his research students who had written a paper about ethnography as being letting go of the side of the pool into the data themselves. So ethnographers and autoethnographers ethnographers swim in the data around them and try to make sense of it. Well, to take that metaphor a little bit further today, participatory research is often just getting into the pool with, and perhaps even an ocean, with other people. And we're together, whatever else you're doing, you're together making sense of every stage of it. What kind of questions, what kind of data is being collected in different kinds of ways. Participatory research methods comprises a whole range of research designs and frameworks that are systematic inquiry, but they are specifically designed to work with and collaborate with those affected by the issues studied. And it's about creating insights to create action or change. Today, and I'll happily share this paper with you, but Vaughan and Jacquet's paper described 27 different kinds of particular tools that have been used for participatory research, and that might not be an exhaustive list. For today's seminar, I am really delighted that I'm going to introduce and hand over to you in a minute to a colleague and Professor Candace Satchell, who is one of the directors of the Institute that I just discussed, the ICC, for Creativity, Culture and Community, and a professor of literacies. And Candice is going to speak a little bit about, I was yesterday at a conference in London for the Independent Press Standards Organization, and this is taken yesterday from a panel discussion there about how to safely give children a voice in modern news. And one of the things there was that children felt they don't have a voice in modern news, and that there is they often just portrayed by people from the outside as either victims or villains. Candice's work tries to address that very question, amongst many others that she does. So I'm really delighted to hand over to Candice to take us through some of the participatory methods that you've been using. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, so thank you for that, Francois. I'm going to talk about participatory research, particularly creative arts approaches and outputs in participatory research. So Francois has already talked a bit about what participatory research means, but I think primarily the point is that it centres the priorities and perspectives of non-academic communities. And for me, it involves working in partnership with children and young people very often, and other research users and beneficiaries. So in other words, who is the research going to benefit? If it's for their benefit, surely they should be involved in the research itself. So the participatory research approaches try to break down traditional barriers that are normally there between the researcher and the researched. So the idea is that it's inclusive, non-hierarchical, and so on, and ultimately collaborative. And it draws upon the knowledge and experience of all the people involved. So it's not about assuming that the researcher has the knowledge. It assumes that the participants have their own separate sorts of knowledge which we can combine in order to create something new together. And there is, I mean, I'm sure people will have noticed that there is a growing interest in participatory research, and it seems to be the thing to do. You've probably heard of co-production and co-creation, which is all part of participatory research, and it is advancing in its importance. But I've been doing this for several years now, and it's quite difficult to think of doing research in any other way now. That doesn't mean to say that you have to do it, but this is the way that I think about it. So having said that, we can't always be as participatory as we might want to be. So I would say that there are degrees of participatoriness. And I'm going to give you a glimpse of a series of different projects which used participatory approaches and principles, but each one may or may not be as participatory as we might like, and hopefully you'll get what I mean. And partly that is influenced by the amount of funding that you have, the way that you can or want to work with different groups, the settings that you're doing it in, the time that you have available, and so on. So there are lots of factors that are going to influence how participatory it's going to be. But I'm going to start with this project, which is called Stories to Connect. And this was a project that was funded by AHRC. And this was, I think, very participatory as far as we could make it. You know, we really wanted to make this very participatory. And the proposal itself was co-written with young people. And these are particularly young people with disabilities who are marginalised by society, who tend not to have a very good deal in life, and who are not very often listened to. So we worked with charities who supported these young people and their care workers, and the young people themselves. We worked in youth groups and different organisations, as well as people from UCLan and students. We did have the funding. This was what made it actually as possible as it was. So that picture on the bottom right is of a conference in Canada, where two of the young people that we worked with came with us and did a presentation at a conference in Canada, which was fantastic because, you know, the young man who is autistic, who's speaking there, he was just incredible, and you know, he would never have had that opportunity without the project, but also without the funding. So these are the sort of principles that underpin the kind of approaches that I try to take. So I'm sure you've heard of Only Connect, which comes from E.M. Forster. That's Stories to Connect. It was the title of the project. And if you understand each other, you will be kind to each other. And I think this was underpinning what the young people wanted. They wanted people to be kind to them, to understand them, to know what it was like to be them and what it was that they needed and how they should be treated. And this diagram shows how the young people from Barnardo's then connected with academics from various disciplines in this university and other universities. And then we started collecting stories with those young people from other young people. So they were peer interviews. They did the interviews, not me, not the academics. And we got involved in story making activities. And then we brought other people in to help them to fictionalize these stories. So we worked with children's authors, creative writers, illustrators, animators, and film producers. So we created some films with them as well, animated films. And the final part, although it didn't go precisely in this order, because you can imagine it was all quite jumbled up, the final part was creating and designing the figitals, which is physical digital artifacts that would tell these stories in community locations. That was the idea. So this is what our young researcher workshops looked like. These all took place out of school time. They were during holidays, evenings and weekends. We had long workshops during the summer holidays, Saturday events, evening events, and so on. That was deliberate in order not to have it in an institutional setting where the young people felt the marginalization that they were already experiencing. We wanted them to feel as comfortable as possible to be as part of it. And it was much easier to do that in social spaces at the university, but also in their own youth groups or whatever. And this is where they were designing the figitals, and I'll show you in a minute what they look like in the end, but this is where we all came together to create things with bits of paper. We did lots of cutting out and sticking, and as you can see, and lots of creative things in order to arrive at what was eventually, these are just some of these digital artifacts. So these are sort of storytelling machines, if you like, which we then took around Preston in various places, put them in various locations in Barnardo's, within the train station, in the park, and we invited people to interact with them. And the stories that they had created were also turned into books. And we have all of these on the website that is attached to this project. They're still up there. We produced 51, I think, storybooks in the end. And these were a real case of, I think this is real co-creation in the sense that each of the stories came from an amalgamation or an assemblage, if you like, of bits of stories from different young people, all of whom kind of informed the way that the story was going to be told, but without attaching it to any one individual. So it was a form of anonymization. We didn't want particular individuals to be identified, but at the same time, we wanted them to have authorship of these pieces. So by involving creative writers and young people in those workshops and taking drafts back to the young people and editing them and getting illustrators in, we finally came up with these as sort of outputs. Okay, so this is what I mean by outputs that are co-produced as well as the research itself. And this, at the university, we have to explain the impact of our research. So these are some quotes from young people. This sort of research doesn't lend itself to, or not particularly anyway, to surveys or quantitative studies or measurements of development or things like that, the psychological development, but it does lend itself to people being able to express what the project has done for them. And you can see that we've talked to the people that were the young people involved. We had a core group of young researchers, but we also had all the people that they then talked to. So the people that they peer interviewed, and all of them contributed. And then we've got quotes from a parent of an autistic child, a charity manager and mental health social worker, and so on. So I won't read them out, but you can see that the impact could be demonstrated in ways beyond sort of quantitative measures. And from this project, we developed, with some of my colleagues in deaf studies, we created another project which was in Indonesia, working with deaf children, and they created their own stories in order to connect with other people who are not deaf, to explain what it was like for them in Indonesia, where their language, Indonesian Sign Language, is not accepted as a language in its own right. And they were able to convey this through animations and a signer. And then I moved on to thinking about storytelling and environmental issues. So participatory research and the environment. A project that was funded and commissioned by Natural England, which is a sort of advisory organisation for the government. They commissioned a study of children's perceptions of quality in outdoor natural spaces. And what they actually wanted was to create some survey questions that were created by and with young people for a survey that they wanted to put out for assessing how young people felt about the environment around them. So this was a bit of an unusual design in that the outcome here was going to be a quantitative measure. It was going to be simply 5 questions to go in a survey that was going to be nationally sent out to children. But the methods that we used, because I thought they would be the best way of doing it, was to use these creative participatory methods. So the young people were positioned as experts in what they thought about outdoor spaces. And so we got them to draw ideal pictures, ideal outdoor spaces where they would like to be. So, for example, here you've got the boy who explained this picture on the left to me. He said, well, we need a river, but it's to jump in. And we need space for skipping and playing. And we need big trees, but they're for climbing and for shade. So he could sort of see the affordances of all the aspects of nature for young people and children. So it wasn't just about, creating a scene. He wanted to show how his activities could be influenced by his environment. And these are just more pictures created by children. These 2 were created by deaf children, actually. And you can see that just on the left one with the beach, you can see that the beach is completely deserted. And the children that we talked to who were deaf, they wanted places that were quiet and not full of people. That would make them very anxious. And you can see just 2 tiny figures at the back there, which is the boy and his mum, and this sandcastle that he's made with her. And that to him was an ideal place to be. Now, collaborative data analysis is another aspect. And in that particular project, we collected together all the things that they thought were significant about the places that they would like to be, the outdoor spaces. And we put them all on pieces of paper. We got them to illustrate these. And then the children sorted all of those ideas into piles, if you like. So they were identifying the themes. And we did that in various different ways, depending on the setting. So this was across the country in lots of different settings. But the picture here is of children who are physically running around a big hall and moving pieces of paper from one table to another, saying, oh, it fits here, but it doesn't fit there. No, let's put it over there. And then they came up with these themes. And through this kind of process, they were doing the data analysis for us, if you like, or with us, which was important because it was their project. It was about them. It was about their perspectives. So moving on, and I might just say that I also wrote an article actually which argued that the construction of the stories in the first project, in Stories to Connect, was also a form of collaborative data analysis, because the children themselves were kind of analysing all the data from their friends that they'd collated together, and then they were picking out the important bits. So that was also a sort of form of collaborative data analysis. And this is a different project, again, 2 projects actually here, which were funded by AHRC. And this was about connecting with landscape. And again, it was to do with nature and going to places where the participants wouldn't necessarily have gone otherwise without the project, and seeing how they could connect with those places and hopefully how we could increase access to those places. So we actually worked with 10 different groups of people on this project. Some of them were children and young people, some were disabled adults, some were people who'd been referred by a GP to a community farm or something like that, and long-term unemployed people. So we worked not just with children in this project. And you can see, again, lots of creative methods. These pictures were taken at a nature reserve for birds. And as part of that, these deaf children, again, I work a lot with deaf children, as you may have noticed. These children were responding to the flamingos, and the way that they responded was by creating a whole new sign, if you like, a whole new sign that would fit into their sign language, which was of a flamingo, which in this case was a sort of embodiment of that flamingo. The boy who invented this sign is the small boy in the distance, standing on one leg. And as a result of him doing that, everybody stood on one leg. And after a while, that symbol came to mean much more than just a flamingo. When I went to see these children later about a completely different project, when I walked into the room, one of them stood up and stood on one leg. And what that meant was, I remember you. We had that great day out at the nature reserve. So, there was a sort of a way of taking ownership of their experiences and bringing that into the project. But we also wrote some stories. You can see here that as a short story on a postcard that was written by one of these children. My name is Chicken Flamingo. I come from Australia. Now, the artist who was involved in this project, we had several different artists working with the different groups of young people. So I'm just showing you these deaf children. She said that this tendency towards negotiation and the ease in agreeing shared signs made me wonder what it would be like if we could work with birds in a shared language that was accessible to both us and to them. And as part of her work, she created, I don't know if this is going to work, she created this piece of artwork. And those 9 pictures that she created, which are very beautifully created, were exhibited in various different exhibitions that we held. And alongside it was an invitation to create your own language through sign, and this was another group who involved in that project. These are young people who went out into the woods and experienced things that this woodland is very close to where they go to college, but they'd never been there before. And the project allowed them to go and experience that. And from that experience, we did some artwork, and one of the young people created this postcard from a deer, which said, and she said about it, the forest is our home. How would you like it? Imagine a stag entering your house, striding in and knocking stuff about. How do you like it? And she was drawing on our own experiences of being in that kind of pristine woodland and treading on things and not knowing what we were treading on, whose homes they were. And she was thinking, what would it be like if that was my habitat and somebody just comes and walks over it? So that was her contribution. And then another young person drew this bird, this buzzard, I think it was. We need to stop deforestation, stop pollution. Humans think we're dominant species, but why should we think that? So this is the way that their thinking was going. And as a result of this, working with a different artist, you can't see the scale of this, but she created this very beautiful piece of artwork, and you can see the picture of the young people that the deer is standing on. It's a kind of and there's a tiny mouse and an owl. But this was kind of co-constructed with the young people. And the artist herself said, I try to include all the ideas from everyone. They all go into a funnel and lead to a core set of ideas. Then we squeeze out the essence of what you want to represent. This is much bigger than it looks on these pictures. It's sort of stood on a table in the exhibition. And these are more artifacts working with different artists. I can't go into all of it because it was a big project, but anyway, we had these really lovely exhibitions as a result of it. And the idea was that we were going to communicate how these different marginalized groups had connected with nature in their own way, and how actually they really deserve to go into those places and it really benefits them, and yet most of the time they feel excluded from them. And then I will go quite quickly through this one. This is my latest project, which is kind of sometimes called Stories Across the Globe. And the point of this project is to find out what children want to know about climate change. So again, it's from their perspective. It's not from my perspective as a teacher or an educator or even a researcher. It's to find out from them what it is that they need to know in order to inform some kind of curriculum that would be relevant to them. And we did this through connecting young people in the UK in various different schools with young people in other countries. So, for example, on a South Pacific island, which you can see here. This project has mostly been unfunded, I have to say. So we didn't have, we haven't been to Fiji. We haven't been able to actually connect them up physically, but we have had them writing to one another by WhatsApp, by post, and so on. And you can see here some of the things that they've written, some of the questions that they had for each other. They were really interested in each other's lives. And the point of the project really was based on the fact that these sort of empathic connections is much more likely to work if you understand more about each other. So we're going back to John Steinbeck, really, if they understand what it's like to live in those places and then what it's like to have the experiences of climate change that they're having, you're more likely to understand that, you're more likely to want to do something about it, quite simply. So it was about sharing cultures, but it was also about sharing the concerns that they have. We did this in schools in Preston, but we also worked with children in the Isles of Scilly, who are, you might say, in not a dissimilar situation to children on a small island in the South Pacific. They are very much under threat of flooding, and they are very concerned. You can tell in the conversations that they have with one another that the children really share this fear of rising sea levels. The picture on the right actually is from Pakistan. We've also connected with Pakistan, but these are just pictures from some of the videos that we've created with the children and shared them. And I should say that I've been doing this project with my colleague Bob Worley, who is a part-time member of staff at UCLan, and with Jacqueline Dodding, who has actually now left UCLan, but she's still really interested in continuing. And this is what the sort of things they produce look like in a research workshop. When we go into schools, sometimes I know that the teachers really want us to do something a little bit more. I don't know, maybe that's not fair because they're always really happy when we go in. But you can see from these that they're very free to draw and write as they wish. And what tends to happen is that things get turned into things that look like this. So sort of schooled literacies, just mentioning my literacy interest. This is a letter actually from a child in the tiny island off Fiji. It's not Fiji, it's an island off Fiji, so it's a very small island. And she has written to one of the children at the school in Preston. And they very much mirror one another in the format. You can see that this is a form of school literacy, but all the same, it has its place. It's a very valuable kind of way of helping them to connect with one another. And these are some of, I mentioned the children who are worried about climate change and rising sea levels. Here are some of the feelings that they've expressed. Again, I won't read them all out. I'll just read one or two. They clearly understand. These are children, by the way, aged sort of 9 to 11. Some of the older ones, we're also working in a secondary school, which we've connected with Pakistan. So they are more like 12 to 13, 14. So they are a bit older, but they're pretty young children that we're working with. But they clearly understand that climate change is happening because of people not taking care of the earth. But they all feel sad. I don't like it in the middle of the nights. It's just going to flood. I feel like it's just going to flood. If we don't take control now, then we're going to be flooded and loads of people are going to be homeless. It's scary to think that one day it might flood. It makes lots of us feel upset and so on. The one that always makes me cry is if the earth was a big person, she'd be crying always. But they also understand all humans need to work together. They're writing stories, and the one on the left is children in the UK. The one on the right is children in the South Pacific island, and they called their story "Nature Saving Nature." Who's going to save the day next time? As this is a really critical question that comes up. You can see written at the bottom, at the end of this child's story. Sea Dude in his story saved the day, but what about next time? And my basic argument here is that literacy is everywhere in everything that we do. So is the environment and climate change, and so is participation. We can include participatory research approaches in all things that we do, I think, to some extent or another. So you might wonder, why choose a participatory approach? Well, it partly depends what you're trying to achieve. There are different degrees, but think about who are the experts, whose knowledge is valued, who will benefit, and what is the wider impact. So that's me, I'm done. And there's some articles relating to those projects if you're interested. Okay, so I will stop.
Thank you so much, Candace. That is absolutely fascinating. We're going to invite questions to both Candace and I on any of this, but I think I'm just going to talk you through a couple of a different approach, but similar. Just to say I'm delighted Candace and I have worked together on two related projects. One is, with that drops out of the News Futures project that I'm going to share with you now. But we also share this common interest, both in participatory methods, but also in literacies and different kinds of literacies, but also in climate issues. So just from, I just want to make sure that mine, the sound plays here. So a little bit, I guess it's important, just as Candace has pointed out, to think of how you as a person came into choosing these methods, because many of us, people on this call, will have probably started thinking about researchers' approaches to take do interviews or surveys or those kinds of techniques in the beginning, some kind of observation. For me, I've been involved in research for some time, and I've used many different kinds of methods, but I constantly got kind of frustrated with the fact that I couldn't make sense of all the data I was collecting. And even though I was doing some kinds of methods that were zooming in and interviewing people and trying to find out from individuals, or zooming out where I was doing some big survey data and using statistical methods in order to try to make sense of the data I was getting, I still didn't feel satisfied that I was even asking all the right questions, or I was understanding really what was going on. And it's that kind of fundamental frustration with my capacity to understand what's going on that is really brought me together with other colleagues in the Media Innovation Studio, where our fundamental approach was to use participatory, human-centered approaches to try to understand the world in some kind of way through innovation that would lead to some kind of learning, that would have some kind of impact on policy, that would work with industry and consultancy and engage the wider public. And so I guess you will have heard and taken away from whatever else many things you took away from Candace, is that this is an approach where there is a level of humility, sometimes frustration, but humility in the point of the researcher to say, I don't even necessarily know the questions. And how can I work with the others to try to understand those and to find answers, but also to make a change for and with the people I'm working with. And that's really at the heart of the approaches we use in the Media Innovation Studio and the project I'm going to talk to you about. So, I come from a farm. I've spoken about this a lot. I'm really think of things from a systems point of view, and with systems, it's always around choosing the boundaries. How do you make, that you live in a huge universe, but you can't make sense of it all at the same time. And so you have to decide on which bits are you going to look at. My kind of philosophical approach, of course, this has also led me to critical realism, because it's made me realize that empirical levels of data, what is visible, even what people tell you in a survey or in an observation, isn't always what's actually happening. That is invisible, even those that we can see. And it may not even be what's real, what's underneath all of this. What are the causal mechanisms that lead to these actual events that lead to the things that are visible? So I encourage you all, if you want to know more about that, there's a whole series of really wonderful videos from the Critical Realism Network on YouTube, and it'll take you through critical realism. This story I'm going to tell you started almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. I was at a journalism conference in Perugia, the International Journalism Festival, and was having lunch with a colleague, trying to make sense of what we'd heard. This was the first of this annual festival in Perugia, and we had just come out of Brexit, conversations, of course, was live. We had COVID going on. There was the war on Ukraine happening. There was conversations. This is even before ChatGPT came crashing into our world. There were conversations about fakes and deep fakes and social media cul-de-sacs, and constantly there was a huge amount of anxiety. And at the heart of that was kind of, how do we know? How do we know what's going on? And I guess the question for us was, how do we know it is trustworthy? How, this is a journalism festival. How do we know the facts we have is trustworthy? And Maria Ressa, who's the Nobel Peace Prize winner for 2021, was also actually at the festival, but constantly argues that without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without trust, you have no shared reality, no democracy, and it becomes impossible to deal with the world's existential problems, such as climate, coronavirus, and things. So how do you get some kind of shared understanding of what's going on? So I launched into a project called News Futures 2035. It's a participatory, multi-stakeholder project, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. It uses foresight methodology. And I want to just tell you a little bit about how foresight differs from forecasting. So I also, since 2009, have been working with the World Association of Newspapers and WAN IFRA, and I've been doing the World Press Trends Outlook study. That's a forecasting survey and a forecasting method where you look essentially at existing data and you use tools and techniques to forecast what might happen in the future. Foresight methodologies is a very different kind of approach. So foresight really gets you to imagine what thinking in a very structured way about what is happening today, but gets you to imagine different kinds of possible futures. And it's this process of trying to think, if we keep going on doing what we're doing today with the climate, what might happen? But if we change our behavior, and something else might happen. So foresight gets you to kind of think about the future and then get people to collectively think, how might we change the future, one kind of future, a desirable or a problematic future? What actions are necessary? So it's a process of backcasting. Or if this is what we want, what do we need to do? If this is what we don't want, what do we need to stop doing or put in place to prevent things from happening? So it's this process where you get people to imagine. Now, the one that the News Futures 2035 project was kind of we anticipated it would be a 9-month project. It turned out to be an 18-month project, and we were busy with the whole thing for about 2 years. We got funding from 2 sources. We got funding from the Google News Initiative, and we got funding a little bit from Research England. We involved more than 300 people, 5 days of workshops, a Delphi study, a survey, interviews. We did 10 rounds of consultations, and those were, as Candace was talking about, getting the participants to help you make sense of the data, not just kind of make sense of the questions, but make sense of and produce the data, but also to help analyze the data. Because in the end of this, we wanted everybody to own the outcome. And this project, by the way, is just continuing. We launched the final report in July at News Rewired, which is a conference in London. And people have the outcome of this process was that people wanted to create a news futures forum, i.e., this multi-stakeholders decided that this process of making sense of issues around this particular question, the future supply of public interest news, was so important that they wanted that process and that research and that discovery and that common understanding and collective actions to continue. So that's where we are right now. We're actually in the process of creating this News Futures Forum and setting up. We're talking to funders and foundations, and we've got a working group and all of those kinds of things that people are already doing. One of those strands of work was something that people said it's not just a supply of public interest news. We need to kind of think about media literacy. And Candace and I were involved in doing another kind of scenario planning workshop, and that's resulted in a policy paper on media literacy, which, to be honest, last Tuesday was again kind of fed into the House of Lords Select Committee, into the future of public interest news, and next, well, on the 4th, I'm meeting with people from our new Minister for Media, Stephanie Peacock, who's from Bonnelly Souths, to feed in. So these research methods that involve people, Candice showed you examples of methods that involve children whose voices aren't heard. I've showed you an example of participatory approaches that have involved quite senior people. People in that workshop included, the senior managing editor of Bloomberg Global, Dame Frances Cairncross, who, people from government, all sorts of very senior people, but also who felt a real need to come together with others from very different perspectives, to try to make sense of things, and that these kind of immersive, co-created participatory methods are incredibly valuable when things are particularly difficult. So this process still continues. A couple of things I want to, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. Happy to tell more. Last week, Andy Brody referenced Claude Levi-Strauss, and today I kind of want to just bring that again. At the heart of any participatory methods process is the fundamental aspect of reciprocity, that we kind of give and take all the time, and that binds people together, and that's the heart of kind of systems of humans. And for me, using a bit like Candace, I actually can't. I'm busy with World Press Trends again. We're putting out the new kind of forecast and trend report for the World Association newspapers, and now again. But for me, the most satisfying way are these participatory methods. It's not just satisfying in the sense that I feel much more certain that we will create impact because people and that we are getting at the heart of the questions because we involve so many people. But I also, I guess the more I research, the more I do, the more I have become humble in my own kind of sense of knowing. The other thing that really drives me, and kind of, I think that Candice has also highlighted it for her, is that the principles of reciprocity in kind of research and participatory methods are that they are non-extractive. It's not like I'm asking people questions and then taking their insights and going to create some IP or intellectual property or something over there. I'm involving people in the research process, and they themselves benefit not just from the end result, but from the participation. They become clearer, more empowered. There's our impact report we've done on this project, and others like Candice will speak a lot to the fact that the participants got value out of doing the research, as opposed to just the outcome of the report or the artifact or whatever's produced. And so for me, that is incredibly important, that my research is both impactful at the end, but non-extractive in its process, and it benefits everybody along the way. I think you've heard a lot from both of us now about different kinds of approaches. I'm going to just bring Candice back in, and then invite any kind of questions you may have or observations.
Hello, thank you very much to both presenters. Very, very interesting. Very interested in this kind of transdisciplinary type way of working. And just on the point that you were making about non-extraction in the process, do you establish, I suppose it depends on the context of the project, but establishing a kind of, when you're walking into a mutual learning space, is everyone aware at that stage of what their, I suppose, part to play in is, and how do you negotiate collaboration, and so on? Everybody's aware of their part to play, but I suppose it's a different one to navigate. I was just wondering an observation you might have on that.
Candice, please. I'm happy to jump in after you.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Anne-Marie, because the way that I've been talking about it and the way that we've both been talking about it, I think, is kind of assuming that everybody's in on it and everybody agrees that they are participating and everybody has the same kind of vision. And that is actually quite difficult to be sure about when you're working with, especially when you're working with children. How do we know that what they've agreed to is what they think they've agreed to? Is that the kind of thing you mean? So I suppose my answer to how you try and deal with that is there's the usual ways of making sure that you have informed consent, and that informed consent needs to be really thoughtfully considered. What are you actually informing them about? How are you telling them? How do you know that they understand? And that might involve, not just filling in a form or signing a form, but engaging in dialogue with them and finding out from them what they want, because that is part, the sort of work I do, that is part of the point. It's what they want from it as much as the way that we've design the project. But I would say it's some sort of ongoing, evolving thing. It doesn't just kind of, you can't make assumptions. I think that's part of the issue with the whole thing. You can't make assumptions about what people think or what people want. So it's constantly checking in and checking back and making sure you're not just steamrollering.
And in particular to the co-creating artworks, the artist as a kind of a part of the research team, or is the artist brought in, and that co-creation and the ownership of the artwork, that's really interesting. I'm really interested in how that was navigated as well.
Yeah, yeah. So the artist was not an academic. The artist was an artist who was brought in order to take that role, but they took, as academics, you know, hanging out in the woods, for example, we kind of all did that together, and therefore we were all in a way contributing to this kind of sense of what mattered and what was important, and being there physically together, but then also reflecting on it together in workshops afterwards with the artist. And I think the part of what was important for me was choosing the artists who would work in that way. And I'm sure there are people who would not, who would much rather kind of paint their own picture or design their own thing. So we deliberately worked with people who we knew had the same kind of ethos as us.
Perfect, thank you.
Just want to jump in a couple of things from a different point of view. So I really echo Candace's point about constantly checking in, being as clear as possible with people all the way through, and that some people participate actively and continuously, and some people don't, because it's hard work sometimes, these projects, and quite difficult. The importance of selecting and curating the participants, I think, is really important. We had a challenge with that because you know, lots of people are interested in this, and so we still have an expressions of interest form, and people fill in and say why they want to participate, and we invite people to different kinds of things. But when I checked in with the two facilitators, Bruno and Elaine, who were advising me and who are really experienced. They've done these participatory projects with policymakers and all sorts of kinds of people for the World Economic Forum and OECD. And, you know, Bruno's day job is actually as head of foresight for the Brussels government. You know, they work with these processes in all sorts of ways. But a couple of things you know, was for us was restless thinkers. So people here who were restless and were questioning, we wanted those kinds of people. And then it's probably, this is recorded, but the other bit was not ourselves. It's a really important, was the advice given to me. People who would listen and want to contribute, and themselves not just want to extract. So we've had participants who come to these workshops who don't participate, don't talk, don't contribute, don't share, don't question. And that's quite extractive because they come to take from what they hear. And so it's not just the researcher who shouldn't be extractive. It's the participants, in adults particularly, I would imagine, who need to not have that extractive research approach. The other thing I just want to say in terms of your point about artists, for those of you, we continue to be really keen on working with artists in even where I am at, and not to instrumentalize them, i.e. in not to make them just make pretty pictures of the content or insights that we've already generated, like a designer or an illustrator, but actually to get their insights in. And so next Tuesday, for those of you interested, we're doing the Journalism Leaders Forum, where we're going to bring together one conversation about where Boris van Wesseling worked with investigative journalists on stories of climate change with a project with the Royal Academy of Arts in The Hague to bring artists and deep investigative research together to think about new ways of storytelling. So this collaboration from different approaches can work on that basis. John, I'm going to bring you in, but I know that Jackie had a question, I think, and then you put your hand down. I just wanted to check. Sorry, Jackie. And then John.
I guess that mine was more an observation, and if other people have questions, they should be prioritized. But I mean, I was really inspired by that. I think there's some I really loved the different ways in which you could get people participating in the research. I guess the way I'm thinking is I've got to do a piece of research that will end up with a X number of words master's thesis, whereas this is I was interested to know, I think you talked at the beginning, Candice, about outputs. Interested to know whether your outputs are the outputs of your participants, as you showed and illustrated so well, or if in addition to that you've also got your X number of words master's written piece of research that's got all the things that we've been asked to do in our projects, or it's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is where you have to. Well, I mean, I have to sort of stamp my academic kind of role on this in the kind of output. So that the very final slide that I showed you was a list of academic outputs. So we had both. We had both the stories and the digital artifacts and the animations and so on. We also had a book for practitioners, which was about how to do this sort of research, which was more like a leaflet, really. And but I've also written with the team, and multiple authors have contributed to the outputs for academic purposes. But yeah, I mean, I still have to write academic articles of 8,000 words to fulfill my obligations as an academic.
So
thank you.
Great. And Jackie, we could talk more about the format of our particular master's output as well, because you're doing advanced applied learning projects, and there's a notional way of describing those. And certainly you will need to put some words down, but what the outputs look like is something we can talk about more. John, thank you for your patience and thank you for your question.
How does collaborative data analysis differ from a purely qualitative data analysis? Are they similar or are they different?
I see what you mean. Sorry. Yeah. Well, I think whenever we do data analysis, there is an element of subjectivity. However much we think there might not be, there is going to be an element of bias that is brought by the researcher, whoever that might be. And much as you might want to argue that you are objective and that you are merely reporting the findings from your data, it's actually quite difficult not to impose your own values and interests, and just because you pick different things up that are meaningful to you. And the way that the young people in my projects think about the data that they were given is very different from me. So their interpretation is really important because it's their voices that we're trying to make heard. And if I was to do it for them, if you like, then I would lose that. It would be much more focused on me than it should be. It's not about me, it's about them. In this case, it's not always the case. Sometimes you just have to do the data analysis on your own. Probably in a master's or a PhD, you're quite likely to do it on your own. But in a participatory project, for it to be truly participatory, ideally you would do the analysis as well as everything else with the participants.
Just also to underline that, I think, John, participatory methods as a qualitative research approach. And as somebody who uses, you know, statistical methods as well, you know, I can underline the fact that all research has a qualitative element. You know, the design of the tools you're using to analyze objective data or quantitative data is qualitative. You know, we can the decisions that programmers made for algorithms in so-called artificial intelligence is qualitative, or Facebook is making and deciding what you're doing. And all of these things have a qualitative element to it. Participatory methods, though, in its stages, is not is a democratic approach, i.e., people participate, but somebody decides. In the end, it's not like it's everybody's voice is considered, but not everybody's voice is highlighted in exactly the same way. You know, it's a kind of collective sense making. And in that way.
Have you found that actively including participants' voices and perspectives in this process fostered greater trust in researchers and you as a researcher?
So I think that's a great question. Thanks, Ivor. Justice, please come in with yours.
My question is, looks like participatory research will also bring the researcher very close to the participant. How do you ensure that you eliminate the challenge of bias for validity and reliability purposes? Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Candace, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. They're both really interesting questions, and I think they do kind of overlap, don't they? So about diminishing bias, and you talking about validity and reliability, and a lot of those terms that we use in research do come from quantitative positivist methodologies, and I think sometimes, I mean, the work I do, I don't claim to be, I'm not a positivist. I don't believe that there is one single way of, I mean, in some cases there, you know, I can ask what this table is made of, and, you know, I can find out what it's made of, and there will be an answer to that. But sometimes there is no one answer, and it depends on perspectives. And the whole point of participatory research is to get different people's perspectives and to understand people differently in different ways. So I think the point is not to try and diminish the bias, but rather to open up the fact that most of what we do is tinted by bias. Most of the way that we see young people with disabilities, for example, is through a lens of some kind of bias, and we're trying to readjust that. We're trying to make people look differently because they're hearing it from a different perspective. So that's the thing about bias. And I think the thing about the power dynamics, which is also a really good point, and that is part of the point of participatory research, it is to break down those power differentials. It's really hard to do that. You can't really do it properly because in the end, you know, we are in a position where we can do things with the data. You know, I have turned them into research articles, and as much as you might take that back to people and say, is it all right if I write this? Do you agree with this? Do you like this? Do you like that? As much as you do that, it's still, there is still a hierarchy there in some respects, but I think it's about doing the best you can to break those down. And therefore, as you suggest, it does, I think, lead to greater trust in researchers. You know, the young people that I work with, it's now nearly 10 years ago. I can't believe that Stories to Connect project started. I was working with some of those just the other evening at UCLan. They still come into UCLan, and we're working on different projects now, but they're the same young people, and they've brought in more young people, you know, so we have this continuous kind of group of people who still work with us. And it's because they do trust us, you know, they know how we work, they like the way that we work. So I think it does help with trust, definitely, and that is really important.
Definitely, in our experience working with, you know, policymakers, senior managers, and other civil society organizations, the fact that people can participate in our approach to something, I would underline that the participatory method isn't about consensus in the projects that we're doing. Okay, it's about mutual understanding of each other's positions. We did not have consensus on what politicians, journalists, civil society activists, and academics think about a particular issue, but it was definitely a better understanding from, i.e., we had Google and publishers and regulators in the room. For example, you know, technology companies don't necessarily agree with what politicians are saying or what journalists in this instance are saying, but they had a better understanding of where they are coming from, and therefore felt they understood the issues and the perspectives better. And everybody felt better informed and less antagonistic, and there was levels of trust built and amongst each other. And I think that that's a really important process. We've got 3 months to go. We could continue to talk, and we hope we will have more opportunities to do that. I'd like to thank Candace very much for the presentation today. I'd like to thank you all for coming, your attention and your questions.